Hello everyone, my name is John Hermans, and thanks for tuning in to Trivium Media, where I dig into the hidden knowledge and history that humanity can use to empower ourselves against those wishing to control and enslave us. And today I want to get into one of my most favorite historical time periods and topics. The time period of the 1st century in the setting of the Roman Empire, and the topic is none other than the true identity of Jesus Christ. However, we're going to be doing it from an angle that you probably haven't heard before, based on the work of researcher Ralph Ellis. The questions we're going to be asking today are ones like, was there any true reference to him in the historical record? And if so, who was he? Is it possible that he was related to none other than Cleopatra? Was he just a poor carpenter as we are led to believe? Or was he actually a king? And who were the Nazarene Jews? We are going to get into the true identity of Saul, or Paul, the creator of Christianity, what his motives were, and his relation to the historical Jesus. And let me tell you, the truth is way more fascinating than the fiction we have been sold. However, it is way more problematic to the entrenched institutions of power, as we will see. This story will give you a front row seat to the Machiavellian power politics of the 1st century Mediterranean world, so buckle up. On a personal note, I'd like to say that I'm not just making this video to destroy the views of modern Christians, as I respect most of their moral teachings and was raised Christian myself. I had a brief 3 or 4 year stint with being a secular atheist before getting into the more esoteric teachings of our past and experimenting with psychedelics, coming back to the truth that there is a divine creator to our reality. While understanding this, it is important to realize the dogma and deception in modern religions, which have largely been created by the dark occult to control the masses, and to keep them from entering the deepest spiritual knowledge which can free humanity from their clutches. Ever since becoming aware that something was off about the biblical stories in my teen years, I was curious, what the hell was going on during this period? Was this the time period that God made an exception to the laws of nature and made himself into a flesh and blood being that could perform miracles? Or was there something more worldly and political going on? When I was a kid, I always thought of this period as being a distant alien place that was so far back into history that it was unrelatable, where the people were simple, poor camel riders and the laws of nature were such that magic could happen. It was as though it existed almost outside of history. Growing up and learning more about the history, I realized that the Jesus story was happening at the height of the Roman Empire's influence and size. This period was known as Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, because Rome had practically no enemies that could pose a threat to its empire, Parthia being its biggest rival at this point, while Egypt just recently being fully annexed by Rome. This is one of the most developed and recorded eras in all of human history, especially by the Jews, who supposedly wrote down everything. You could travel from Judea to Britain, mostly speaking the same language and using the same coins, which makes the fuzziness of the story even stranger to me. Having the events of a religion happen in this period would be comparable to these events happening in today's world, arguably the height of Western civilization. And 300 years from now, that religion had taken over a good size of the world's population. Though nowadays this would probably be more like aliens landing or something, fake or otherwise. So with that, let's jump into the story. Ralph Ellis's first book on this subject, Cleopatra to Christ, attempts to prove to the world that Jesus was none other than the great-grandson of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar is murdered on the Senate floor, resulting in Cleopatra and her son by Julius Caesar, Caesarion, having to flee the city. However, Ellis also suggests that Cleopatra was pregnant at the time with Julius Caesar's child. Prior to the assassination, there were wild rumors going around about Caesar and Cleopatra. While most of the descriptions are vague, a quote from Cicero might give us a clue. "I am grieved to hear of Tertia's loss of an unexpected child, but I will soon be glad of such a loss in the case of Queen Cleopatra and their expected scion of the breed of Caesar. This child has supposedly been lost to history." Ralph is not the only historian that has noticed this lost child. Other historians will say that the child most likely died young because there is no more apparent mention of it. Following this period, a civil war ensued, pitting the alliance of Mark Antony and Cleopatra against Octavian. Ultimately, Octavian emerged victorious, leading to the tragic end of Antony and Cleopatra committing suicide. Years later, in 25 BC, Octavian needed to shore up his hold on the province of Mauritania in North Africa. He had in his possession the children of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Octavian installs an old acquaintance named Juba II and also weds him to Cleopatra and Antony's daughter, Cleopatra Selene. This was obviously an honor. Selene was an attractive young princess, and as of the Ptolemy era, was seen to be the manifestation of the goddess Isis herself. A good gift if your intention is to strengthen an alliance. This example is showing how politics was done in ancient Rome, as well as many other points throughout history. Over in the east in the Parthian Empire, Phraates IV has just retaken his throne, looking to cement a long-term, peaceful relationship with Parthia, and to get back the military standards that Crassus had lost 30 years earlier. A huge symbolic importance to the military, and a wound on their pride. Octavian needs to give King Phraates something special, something that shows respect and a desire for a lasting friendship. Well, Cleopatra and Mark Antony's daughter, Cleopatra Selene, was already married off to King Juba II, who was notably less influential. So what does he do? Well, instead of a princess, King Phraates IV, king of the second most powerful state in the region, gets an Italian slave girl named Thea Musa. Now, does this make sense? Ralph Ellis's claim is that this is simply not something that Octavian would have done, and that instead the child was none other than the lost child of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar that Octavian had kept this whole time. Now at 19 years old, the perfect age to marry off to a king you are trying to ingratiate. Other than the obvious reason that Octavian would need to gift the king of Parthia someone higher than the status of a slave girl, there are 8 other reasons that Ralph gives for linking Thea Musa to Cleopatra. I'll list a few of them here. Firstly, this type of marriage alliance between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the kings of Parthia/Persia has happened before in the past. One example was Cleopatra Thea, around the year 150 BC, who actually became queen to 3 Seleucid kings. Secondly, there is a Parthian parchment dated to 20 BC, naming the wives of King Phraates, just 5 years after the marriage to Thea Musa. And the names are Olenir, Biserta, Bisapenaps, and Cleopatra. This is odd. Was Thea Musa just her official name, while her primary name was actually Cleopatra? Third is her actual name, Thea Musa Urania, translating into Queen of Heaven, or Goddess of Heaven. In the Egyptian tradition, this is the goddess Isis, the same goddess that the Ptolemaic princesses are supposed incarnations of. A pretty highfalutin name for a slave girl. Fourth, Thea Musa and King Phraates IV had at least 2 children that we know of. Phraates V, also known as Phraates, and Julia Urania, coincidentally taking the surname of Gaius Julius, or Julius Caesar. And fifth, if you look at the depictions of the two, they look eerily similar. Here is a side-by-side of the two, notably having very similar mouths, nose, and chin. There are more reasons that Ralph mentions, but we're going to move on for now. What's interesting about this slave girl is she actually becomes Phraates' #1 wife. She becomes highly influential over King Phraates and convinces him to give back Rome's military standards, and also to give his 4 sons as hostages to Rome. All of his sons, except Phraates V, his son with Thea Musa. And the reason becomes obvious. She wanted her son to rule Parthia, and it could have been Phraates' plan all along to put Phraates on the throne. Maybe he sent his sons to Rome in fear of usurpation from them. Either way, Thea Musa and Phraates needed this transition to happen quicker than it was happening naturally, because in 2 BC, they poisoned King Phraates and usurped the throne. They also became lovers, something that might have been an Egyptian custom, but was highly frowned upon in Parthia. This led to an uprising in Parthia, and the eventual fleeing and exile of the mother-son duo from the Parthian Empire to somewhere in Syria. Ralph Ellis is unsure of exactly where in Syria until writing a few books on the subject. He finally finds the answer by cross-referencing Parthian records. The place this king and queen landed was a place called Edessa in northern Syria. This once prominent kingdom has virtually been erased from history, a mystery we will soon unravel. Rome granted them control of this kingdom, tax-free, to serve as a buffer between Parthia and Rome. Here is a summary of this arrangement by contemporary historian Josephus Flavius. Herod learns about a Jewish man from Babylon who, along with 500 horse-riding archers and about 100 of his relatives, has crossed the Euphrates River and is now living in Antioch, Syria. This man and his group were given a place to live called Valatha by Saturninus, the Roman official in charge of the area. So that sets up the foundation of this story. But what does this have to do with Jesus? Well, it is Ralph Ellis's theory that Jesus was a descendant of this very royal line, and not only that, he was the leader of the Jewish revolt from AD 66 to 69. Now you are probably immediately skeptical because this is after Jesus' death in the Gospels in the AD 30s. However, Ralph explains how there has been a deliberate altering of the timeline of these stories, ensuring they don't actually correspond to any historical characters. Because the real story in the New Testament is the story of the Jewish revolt and the events preceding that time in the AD 50s and 60s, dealing with the divisions and infighting between the different Jewish sects and the tension with Rome that led to the revolt. It appears the contemporary historians of the day overlooked the story of the biblical Jesus, as if it never occurred. But after all, he was just a humble, poor carpenter, wasn't he? Well, when we take the stories of the Gospels and move them 40 years into the future, all of a sudden everything pops into place, aligning perfectly with the writings of the historian Josephus Flavius. That gets us to the other crux in this story. Josephus is one of the most important and controversial characters in the first century, who wrote basically everything historical we know about this time and place, and he is integral to this story. However, Ralph discovers a finding that while likely other historians known before him, was kept hidden due to the potential repercussions of revealing it. According to Ralph, it is just too obvious for someone not to have seen before. Ralph's discovery reveals that Josephus Flavius was in fact the biblical character known as Saul, also known as Paul, and was the primary architect of what was then simple Judaism, now known as Christianity. The ironic part of this story is that simple Judaism was actually a competitor to the Church of Jesus and James, who were a part of the Nazarene or Galilean sect of Judaism. There are many similarities between the biblical Saul and Josephus, and when we take the 40-year chronological chasm into account, we can see that they are actually the same person. We will get more into this later. Before we get there though, let's start at the beginning by looking at the nativity scene and seeing what story is actually being told, and move forward from there. When we look at the nativity scene, what we're really looking at is the birth of an exiled prince of Persia. It most likely didn't happen in a manger, but the family was just uprooted and might have not been fully settled in yet. However, they most likely had been there for quite some time. So this is mostly just showing the humble origins of this dynasty. Jesus is most likely the grandson of Theusa and Pharartaces, and was likely born in the AD 30s. The story of the three kings from the east, or the three Persian magi, is telling us that this was the birth of Parthian royalty. Not only a king of Persia, but a king of Egypt, as Jesus was called the Egyptian many times in the Bible. And as we can see, he had the bloodline of the Egyptian Ptolemaic dynasty. Jesus was called a king in the Bible 36 times. So was he a king, or was he a simple carpenter? If Jesus was indeed a king, it would make sense that emissaries from Parthia would come visit, as there was still a chance that the line would ascend the Parthian throne, and he would definitely still have loyal followers from Parthia. Ralph theorizes that this carpenter is a mistranslation or deliberate cover-up of the true meaning. The Greek word tekton could also be translated to a higher skilled trade, like an architect, or in Ralph's opinion, a mason, as in Freemasonry. Now, mainstream Freemasonry has only been around since the 1700s, but its roots obviously go way further back, to the Templars and beyond. And when you start to take into account what the Nazarene sect of Judaism was teaching, this starts to make a lot of sense. After all, anyone who knows anything about Freemasonry knows that in its essence is esoteric Judaism. One of the most venerated and worshipped figures in Freemasonry is none other than the architect of Solomon's Temple, Hiram Abiff, as well as the Jewish Kabbalah. Now that we suspect Jesus was actually a Parthian/Egyptian prince, let's dig deeper into the historical context and Gospels to see exactly what story is being told to us about these tumultuous times in Judah. Let's begin with an overview of the landscape of Judaism in that region during this period. What Ralph's evidence is telling us is that the historical Jesus was actually the head of the Nazarene or Galilean sect of Judaism during that time, otherwise called the fourth sect of Judaism by Ellis, whereas the other sects were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The most important of these was the Pharisees, as they were the most influential and seen as the orthodoxy at the time. According to Josephus Flavius, the Nazarene or Galilean sect was started by Judas of Gamala with revolutionary ideas. Could this be the historical John the Baptist, the precursor to Jesus? One thing to know about the Nazarene sect is that it was very Egypto in nature compared to the other groups. This sect venerated the zodiac, which was seen to be heretical at the time to a lot of Jews. However, at one point the zodiac was the primary symbol of Judaism. This makes sense when you realize Judaism itself came out of Egypt and was therefore influenced by its traditions. There's a lot of physical evidence for this, as zodiacs from that era are found all over the area. At the time of Jesus' birth, the zodiacal ages were in transition from Aries to Pisces. This might be able to give us insight to the phrase, Jesus was born a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men. We can see by this picture the central ray emanating off the central figure is pointing right between the constellation Aries and Pisces, which gives us an accurate date of when this was made, debunking the claim by mainstream historians that this was from later centuries. The Nazarene sect was definitely related to the Zealots in the Bible. These people were thought to be an extreme messianic version of Judaism, therefore a problem to the Roman authorities and the other Jewish sects. Let's go back and take a look at Saul, who was actually a lesser of the disciples that came about later on. But is he just a made-up character? Ralph Ellis would tell us yes, and that he was actually the character of Josephus Flavius. What evidence does he have for this? Because if Saul was actually Josephus Flavius, then we know who the biblical Jesus was. Here are a few similarities between the two characters. They were both raised as Jews in Jerusalem. They were both Roman citizens and Romophiles, which was uncommon for Jews at the time in that area. They were both Pharisee rabbis. They were both against the Jewish revolt. They both had visions and changed sides. They were both controversial and reviled by many, even being stoned on many occasions. They both were on a prison ship to Rome, which wrecked on Malta. They both survived the shipwreck and were taken to Naples to see Emperor Nero. While Saul was in prison himself, it was reported that Josephus was there to advocate for certain rabbis that had also been detained, and to also talk about the Temple Wall drama, where the Jews built a wall to prevent line of sight by Roman authorities. This trip was most likely in AD 62. After going to Rome, they both became authors and had the same publisher. They both became chief of police in Galilee. This is important because they were both chasing around and persecuting a character called Jesus. The fact is, the more you look at these characters, the more similarities you will find. So why would they do this? If you go back to the 20s and 30s, these events are simply not in the historical record. So let's give the overall story of what was going on during that time. That is the lead up to the Jewish revolt in the AD 50s and 60s. So leading up to the Jewish revolt, we have this rebellious sect of Judaism called the Nazarene sect being bankrolled and led by the exiled Edessan royal family. They had control over northern Syria and the Jordan area as a client/buffer state of Rome. This family might have just been the wealthiest family in the Roman Empire at the time. It's here that we get the character Izates, or Isis II, who Ralph Ellis actually claims is the historical Jesus, also known as Jesus of Gamala or Jesus of Zappias. Josephus also calls this character the Egyptian, and later refers to him as the Egyptian false prophet. Of course, according to this theory, Jesus had Egyptian ancestry from the Ptolemy dynasty, and even according to the Bible, he spent much of his youth there, learning the esoteric ways. So it isn't surprising that Jesus would be called the Egyptian. In the Bible, a Roman officer asked Paul after he's arrested, "Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days maddest in uproar, and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" Referring to Jesus of Gamala. And of course Paul says that he's not, and says that he is a Jew from so-and-so. However, is this reference simply put in there to separate the historical Jesus and the biblical Jesus? We see a similar story when Jesus draws a crowd of 5,000 and brings them out into the wilderness and miraculously feeds them with 5 loaves of bread. It just so happens that this Jesus of Gamala was said to have married Martha Boethus, the daughter of the richest man in Jerusalem, Simon Boethus, sister of Mary Boethus. Starting to sound oddly familiar, but at the same time it seems a little off. Now the biblical characters are all of a sudden in the main flow of historical events, and they are the oligarchs of their day, not poor carpenters and prostitutes. Here are a few more similarities between the biblical story and the lead up to the Jewish revolt in the AD 50s and 60s. Here we have in the writings of Josephus. Moreover, there came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitudes of common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which he lay over against the city, and at a distance of 5 furlongs. He said further, that he would show them from hence how, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, and he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls when they were fallen down. Here we have the same story told from the Bible. Luke 22:36. Then said he unto them, But now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. And they said, Lord, behold, there are 2 swords. And he came out, and went to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples also followed him. We also have Jesus discussing the fall of Jerusalem's walls, just as the Egyptian prophet, here in Luke 19:43. And when Jesus came near Jerusalem, he wept over it, saying, The days will come upon you when your enemies will cast a trench about you, encompass thee around, and keep you penned in on every side. And they will flatten you level with the ground, and they will not leave even one stone upon another. Here we basically have the same speech at the same location from the same person. And then the story goes on from Josephus. Now when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons, and came against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem, and attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them, and took 200 alive, but the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight. Here we have a similar story from the Bible. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests, came with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote off the ear of the high priest's servant. John 18:3. In the gospel story, they describe this as a band of men, making you think that it was nothing more than a small ruckus. However, in the original Greek, the word used for band of men is spira. This can be more accurately translated to a cohort, or 600 armed Roman soldiers. Here is another quote from Jesus in the Bible. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. This tends to be true in times of revolution, as divisions happen between family members and friends. While some support the cause, others cling to entrenched authorities. These similarities, and many others, cause big problems because they show that the gospel stories came out of the writings of Josephus Flavius. If this is the case, it shows that the Gospels weren't written down until the AD 70s. It also shows that Jesus was involved in some sort of revolt. In Mark 15:7, it discusses Jesus being jailed alongside revolutionaries that took part in the insurrection. Well, what insurrection was this? Here's a graph put together that shows the similar events that took place during the Gospel stories in the writings of Josephus Flavius during the lead up to the Jewish revolt. Josephus Flavius was actually in the employ as an envoy to this Edessan family, as it is mentioned that he organized and delivered a famine relief payment to Jerusalem on behalf of the family. Saul Josephus, as a young man, was also part of the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James, and was sent on a missionary trip across the Roman Empire to spread the Church of Nazarene to other Jews. The trouble is, he finds, is that the other Jews aren't really interested to hear what he has to say, and he is stoned and ridiculed. His teachings are heretical, after all. However, he finds that the Gentiles are actually interested in what he has to say, as some of the beliefs would almost seem more pagan. However, they didn't like some of the rules that the Nazarenes were enforcing, like circumcision and kosher food laws. With this reality, he goes back to Jesus and James and asks for their permission to create a new church of simplified Judaism. Here they got rid of the kosher food laws and circumcision. We see this depicted in Galatians 2. This is the actual creation of Christianity. This church becomes very successful and actually becomes a competitor to the Church of Jesus. Saul Josephus ends up becoming a very powerful man on behalf of the Romans, possibly since the year 62 when he went to go see Emperor Nero. This is when it is thought he might have even become an agent for Rome. he starts persecuting members of the Nazarene church, including Jesus himself. "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" At this point, he had his own church of Simple Judaism and probably had some authority as the commander of Galilee. Acts 9:12. Saul was breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of Jesus. He went unto the high priest and desired of him letters of authority, arrest warrants, that if he found in any of the way, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. In Josephus' own works, he says, "At a mass meeting in the temple of Jerusalem, the high priest appointed additional generals for the army. Both parts of Galilee were assigned to Josephus, son of Matthias." So was Saul the commander of Galilee as well? Well, if he was Josephus, then yes. One issue that the royal family might have had with Rome at the time is that it is evident that Rome started to demand a tax from the Edessan monarchy, where before they were tax-free, other than taxing their own tenants. This family, under the leadership of Esus II, leads a rebellion against the Romans, Esus effectively becoming the king of the Jews and a messiah to those in the movement. Interesting timing, this is right in the upheaval in the wake of Nero's death, the year of 5 emperors. Vespasian is the general fighting the revolt, until he hears that he is being favored for the throne, where then he leaves his son Titus to finish putting down the revolt. And put down the revolt he did. Jesus' forces were not enough to stand up to the Roman military power. During this turbulent time, what would have happened if Jesus would have been successful in his rebellion? Would he have just been content to lead a new Judeo-Syrian state, or would he have ambitions for the seat of Rome itself? Well, the latter, according to Ralph. This was the richest family in the empire who had a kingdom of their own already. With Rome's biggest military force out of the way, and the seat of the empire in turmoil, it is possible that Jesus would have been able to take Rome with ease. After all, he had a right to the throne in his mind. He was the last of the Julian line, descended from Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. Nero would not have been the last Julian. Jesus would have continued the Julian line, although a different branch. Think of how different the world would be. Is this Messiah the actual Messiah that Judaism says is coming, versus the peace-loving pacifist that modern Christianity has sold us? I would argue yes. The Jewish Messiah is said to be a world king. Taking over the Roman Empire at the time would be the closest thing to that, and you can see how his followers would actually think that he was the Messiah. This is why this family and its kingdom has effectively been whitewashed from history. Vespasian must have ordered Josephus Flavius to write a history of this time, but to also write the Gospels under the pen name of Saul. These extremely similar characters, one historic and one in the Gospels, coincidentally had the same publisher. This was the single biggest event of the 1st century and a blemish on Roman authority. So how is Rome to handle this? Well, firstly, the Edessan monarchy is destroyed and looted and used to fund the construction of the Colosseum. The Nazarene church was destroyed, and the Jesus character was made into a pacifist and used as a central character in Saul Josephus' growing church of Simple Judaism. Of course, this character couldn't exist in the years leading up to the Jewish revolt because it would give away his true identity and show that he wasn't actually a pacifist. So to do this, they moved the story back 40 years to a more peaceful time. This created all sorts of issues that couldn't be reconciled and eventually gave away the truth. So what happened to Jesus after his defeat? Well, Ralph suggests that he was actually sent to Britain to a prison camp. This was done to prevent him from becoming a martyr by killing him, and to make sure he was as far away from his power base as possible. Ralph also presents evidence that Mary Magdalene, or Mary Boethus, fled to France, where her bloodline continued in the Orange dynasty in southern France, now the current Dutch royalty. However, we know that these bloodlines have been intermixing for thousands of years. This is basically the basis of the Da Vinci Code story, the bloodline of Jesus being present in the royal bloodlines of Europe. Some other researchers, such as Michael Tessarion, suggest that the 4th and 5th sects of Judaism can be traced throughout history, mostly at odds with each other, but coexisting for the sake of maintaining the overall feudal system. The 4th sect being the royal houses of Europe, spread by Mary Magdalene and her entourage, and the 5th sect being the Roman Catholic Church. The 4th sect being more liberal or radical in nature. Not that they were so interested in the common good, though some might have had that motivation, but more so to create chaos in the Roman Catholic order so that they might take power for themselves. They can also be seen manifesting in organizations like the Knights Templar and the Freemasons. possibly being influential players in the Reformation and the French and American revolutions. Those are topics for another time though. What we do know is that whatever happened in the 1st century AD has reverberated throughout the past 2 millennia, and almost no other time has had such a visible influence on the modern world, as Christianity still has 2.4 billion followers. And though I think Christian morals have largely been a good thing, it has also been used to keep the population passive and obedient. The Jewish revolt led by Jesus was also the last time that the Jews had control of the region of Judea before the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, a saga that is still going on today. Well folks, I hope you enjoyed this fascinating alternative look into the 1st century Roman world. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe.